Good. All our previous interactions with the DOM using JavaScript were happening instantly. So the moment user opened up the page, all the functionality that was in our app.js file was executed. And that's all nice. But if I want to make our project really interactive, we need to start responding to events. Now, event could be a simple mouse click, or it could be a window scroll, or it could be a form submission, just to name a few. And a couple of remarks about the upcoming videos. Since there are so many events in JavaScript, the plan is not to cover them all. In fact, we're only going to cover a few of them during the tutorial, since our goal is to understand the principles behind the events. And once you're going to understand the principles, then trust me, it is very easy to learn a new event. And eventually we're going to cover more events during the project, because it makes more sense if we're building something, then we cover the actual event. Again, most importantly, please understand the principles behind events, because all of them are exactly the same. Also, in order to keep things simple, we're going to continue using simple color examples. There is really no point of overcomplicating our tutorial part. And just to give you a quick taste of what we're going to cover in the following videos, imagine that you have a site with a heading 2, with a paragraph as well as the button. And the moment I'm hovering over the paragraph, in fact, I'm adding the classes, the CSS classes, to my heading. Notice, it's only happening if I'm hovering over the paragraph. Now, I can also do the same thing with, let's say, a button click. So once my user clicks a button, then I'm adding a different class. And I'm adding a different class to my heading. So again, a simple example of what we're going to cover in the following videos. And then within the style tags, I have a few styles that we're going to use somewhat extensively throughout the next videos. And back in the app.js, the 3 core principles about the events are following. First, we're going to need to select the element. So whether I'm going to be listening for the events on the button or the heading, there's a difference. So if you would like to respond to click events on a button, you're going to have to select the button first. If you'd like to actually listen for click events on the heading, then you need to select the heading. That's step number 1. Then on the element that you have selected, you need to add the add event listener. And essentially we have the node, of course, as our response, as the data that we're getting back. And we just have a method of add event listener. And then within that add event listener, we need to pass into arguments. What event are we going to be listening for? And the second, what are we going to do? So the callback function, what is going to be our response? So let's say a user clicks a button. What is it that we would want to do? Okay, so let's start very simply by selecting the button, since I would like to listen for the click events on the button, not on a heading. If you want on a heading, of course, just select the heading. And I'm going to go with const btn, that is equal to document, then query selector, since I'm just going to use the class. And then, of course, I misspelled the const. That's the reason why I have the error there. And let's just select the button. And once I have the button, like I said, we get back our node object. And on that node object, we have a method with a name of add event listener. So btn, add event listener. And then we need to pass in 2 things. So what event are we going to be listening for? And the second one is the callback function. As far as events, again, there's many of them. And click event is most likely going to be the most simplest one. And you just type in click. That's it. Now we're listening for click events. However, we haven't set up the callback function. So what are we going to do? So remember when in the previous section I covered callback functions, I said that you are going to use them extensively when working with DOM. Why? Well, because I don't want that function to run right away, correct? I don't want that function to run right away when the user opens up my web page or application. I only want to run this callback function once the user clicks on the button or, I don't know, on some other element or something like that. But the whole idea behind adding a callback function is that I don't want that functionality to run right away, be executed right away. I only want it to be executed once that particular event takes place. And we have a few options. You can either write it as an anonymous function, like so. So we just pass in our callback function as our anonymous function, or we can set up a function and then just reference it. So for our first example, I'm just going to use an anonymous function, and then in the future videos, of course, we're going to cover how we can set up the function and how we can reference it and what would be the gotchas. And then you're probably wondering what you can write within a function. Truly, anything you would want. We can start very simply by just console logging. Hey, you click me, like so. Now let's test it out. So if I head over to my button, and if I click it, I should have within the console, hey, you click me. Very, very simple. Now, is it the only thing we can do with just our callback function where we have console log? Of course not. So what we're going to do right now is set up the functionality that we already covered in the previous videos. So let's say I would want to add one of the classes to my heading 2. How about I would do that? Well, I would obviously need to use the class list. Remember, that was one of the things. And then also we would need to select that particular element. So not only we're listening, of course, for the events on the button, we would also need to have access to the element that we would want to do something with. So in our case, that would be a heading. We can select the heading within our function, within our callback function, or in this case, we can also select it separately here on top of the event listener. Again, in this case, it doesn't make sense. There's going to be cases where you can only do the selections already within your callback function, because essentially you're not going to be able to access those elements outside. Okay, so let's do that. Let's say const. I'm going to go with heading, then a document, then I'm looking for the, again, query selector. Then we're going for the heading 2. I believe that was my heading. And once I have access to my element, well, then I'm just going to simply say that the moment I click on the button, then I would like to add the class. We already know how to do that. So heading, class list, then we're going to add that particular class. And again, you can pick and choose whatever class you would want to add. In my case, I'm going to add a class of red. And let's see what was going to be our result. Let's refresh, and the moment I click on a button, check it out. Now we have added this class. Currently, of course, I can keep on clicking, nothing is happening. So we haven't covered how we can set up a if statement here and actually check whether the class is there or not. And don't worry, we're going to do that in the following videos. But the most important point is now we understand how we can respond to events. So again, we need to select the element, then we need to add event listener, what event and what we would like to do. If you would like to apply some changes to a different element, then of course you're going to have to select that particular element. That element could be any element you would want, but again, you would need to have access to it. You can do it either within the callback function or you can do it outside. And as far as callback function, it could be anonymous or it could be a function reference. And lastly, I would just want to cover that you're probably going to see once in a while the old way of adding events in JavaScript, and that was inline, where it was happening within the index.html. Let's say we have the paragraph, then again we're listening for click event, and then we're just adding a class of red. Now that is an old way of doing that, and it's not a good approach, and you should be avoiding this type of syntax at any cost. It's still going to work, but there's many issues with that. So even though you might see it once in a while in someone else's old code, this is not something that you should practice whenever you're writing your own JavaScript applications. In fact, we're going to check whether that particular class is there. If the class is there, then we're going to remove that particular class, the class of red, or whatever class you added. If the class is not there, then we're going to add it, as well as we're going to cover how we can add a callback function as a reference, not as an anonymous function. And I guess we're going to start with that, where I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to say function, and I can call this function, of course, however I would like, but I'm going to call this change colors, like so. And what I'm going to do within this function? Well, I guess let's just start by simple, again, console log with a hello, and let's just change around a bit our add event listener, where instead of the anonymous function, right now I would want to pass a reference to the change colors. However, one gotcha about doing this kind of approach is the fact that you don't want to run this function right away. So you don't want to invoke it there and then within the event listener, because that essentially just messes up everything that we did before. Check it out. I right away have the hello in the console. Now, do I want to run this function right away, or do I want to run it when I click, in fact, on a button? And notice, essentially, as we're clicking on a button, nothing happens, because we already invoke our callback function right there and then. So always, whenever you're passing it as a reference, keep it as a reference. So just type change colors, that's it. And then set up whatever functionality you would want over here. And if you don't like this kind of approach, of course, you can always use the anonymous functions like we already covered in a previous video. Let me save it. And let's just see that now hello only appears in the console when, in fact, we click on a button, not right away when the user opens up the page. And if we have covered, we can, of course, have the function as a reference. Now I would like to set up some kind of logic, where again, I would like to check whether that particular element does have the class or doesn't. That way we can set up some toggling functionality. And the way we do that is again using the class list. Remember, class list had the contain. And in this case, we can right away set it up within the if statement. That is always an option. But just to make it a bit more straightforward, I'm going to assign it to a variable. So I'm going to say let, and I'm going to use, has class variable, and that is going to be equal to a heading. So I'm just checking the heading. Then there is a class list, and then remember it has a contains. So does it contain the class of red? Does it have already class of red? And we're going to have two options. Either this value is going to be true, or it is going to be false. There's no other option that we have. Either we have the class, or we don't have the class. We could definitely write this as a const as well. Once in a while, I just like using let. There's no particular reason over here. And again, you can apply this directly within the if. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up if, and then I'm going to check has class. Is it true or is it false? So if the element already has the class, then I would like to remove it. How do we remove the class? Well, we do the same thing. We say heading class list instead of contains or add. We go for remove. Then we specifically say what kind of class we would like to remove. In my case, that is red. And then, of course, the second thing I can say is else. So if the class is not there, then I would like to add it. That's how we can set up our conditional. Again, I know I said this before, but you can just cut this out and pass it here right within the if condition. In my case, I just wanted to make it a bit straightforward where I set it up as a variable. And now, of course, I'm just going to copy and paste it like so. And then instead of remove or contain, I'm going to look for add. So if the element doesn't have the class, then I would like to add. And now, of course, we have our toggling functionality. Check it out. I click, and then I'm just checking. If the class is there, awesome. Then I'm just going to remove the class. If the class is not there, well, then we're going to add it. And that's how we can set up our function, our callback function, as a reference. And that's how we can add more sophisticated functionality within our callback function. So let's go with const. Heading is equal to document query selector, and we're going to be looking for the heading. Now, in this case, of course, I misspelled the const. That's the reason why I have the error. And I'm going to be targeting the heading 1. Now let's copy and paste. And we're going to select the button. That's the reason why I changed my selection. And then also I'm going to change my variable. So I'm going to have the button. And now for the button, I'm going to set up 3 events. Click event, mouse down, as well as mouse up. By the way, I misspelled here. And then we're going to see which one fires first, which one fires last. And that's when we're going to cover what is the actual event. I think that is going to be a little bit quicker. So let's go with add event listener. We're listening for the click event. Then I'm going to go for an anonymous function. Again, you know already how to set up a function reference if that's what you're looking for. And then let's just write console log. You clicked me. You clicked me, like so. And I'm going to copy and paste. And we're going to set it up the second one for the mouse down. mouse down, and we're going to change this to a down. So the value within a console is going to be down. And then also for the mouse up, we're going to have within a console up. So let's change the text here. And instead of mouse down, we're going to write mouse and up. And you're probably wondering, well, which element is going to fire first? Well, there's no better way than just testing out. Let's click it up and let's see that. We have down, so that fired first when the button was pressed. And then mouse up, event fired when, in fact, we released our button. And then lastly, click event fired when both of these actions occur. So that would be the difference. Again, if you would need more control, you could use mouse down and mouse up. In most cases, again, most likely you're just going to stick with click because that one fires when both of the actions happen. Okay. Then also let's take a look at the mouse enter and mouse leave. And mouse enter would fire when we moved on to the element. So essentially, as we are on the element of the heading 1, then something is going to happen. And once we moved out of the element, then the mouse leave is going to fire. I already have the heading, so I can just say heading, then add the event listener, then I'm going to be looking for mouse enter. And then in this case, what I would like to do is I would like to add the class. One of the classes that I have within the style tags, and I think I'm going to go with a blue class. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to say as I'm entering the heading element, I would like to add a class, and we already know that we can use the class list for that. So we're going to go with heading class list, add, and the class name is blue. And again, if you're wondering, within the index.html, I just have this class of blue. Now you can add whatever styles you would want, of course. I'm just showing you where I'm getting this class from. Then, of course, I don't need to use the dot. That was a mistake. And now, as I'm hovering over the element, notice I'm applying this particular class. Because when we moved on to an element, then our particular event fired. And of course, we can also set it up as we move out of the element. So that's when we use mouse leave. Then let's say we're going to remove that class. So let's copy and paste it. And we're going to say that mouse enter is going to be right now mouse leave. And now we're going to remove our class. We're going to say remove the class of blue. And in this case, we're going to have our hover effect, whereas I'm moving on to an element, in this case heading 1, then of course applying the class, and as we move out, then we remove the class. And if you're looking at it, you're like, okay, but I can definitely do that already in CSS. And you're 100% correct. It doesn't mean that just because you can do something with JavaScript that you have to. If there is a simpler solution where you can just use a CSS, of course do it. It's not like you have to set up the whole logic with JavaScript just to do something that you already previously could achieve just simply using CSS. That is not the goal. The goal, of course, is that you're going to have probably something more complicated than just adding classes or removing classes. But since, again, I would like to keep my examples very simple, that's the reason why we just added the class as we moved on to an element. And then when we left the element, then we removed our class. For our events. And that's the reason why up in the index.html, I created a simple input with a type of text as well as some kind of ID just so I can target that input. And then up in the app.js, we're going to select it, and I'm going to name this name input is equal to document. And then, of course, again, I misspelled the const. That seems to be my jam. And then let's write document, get element by ID. And I'm looking for the element with an ID of name. Now, once I have my element, then I would like to take a look at the key press as well as the key down. And what would be the difference? So let's go with name input. Then we're going to do add event listener. And we're going to be listening for key press. And then again, let's set up our anonymous function. And let's just console log you pressed a key or something like that. And then also we're going to do the same thing with a key down. First, I guess let's try it out with our first simple input as well as the key press. And as I keep on pressing, notice how in the console it says you pressed a key. All right, so we're listening for a key press event. I'm going to leave it for your reference. So I'm going to do copy and paste right now, but I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to say that I would like to, or that's not what I wanted to do. Let me just properly comment this out. So let's select, let's comment this out. And instead of key press, we're going to be looking for key down. And in this case, again, we're going to say you press the key. So I'm not going to change the value, or the difference is going to be that this event is going to fire as you're in fact going to be holding on to a key. So as with the key down, it fires when the actual key is down. Now, lastly, we have a key up. And with the key up, we're also going to make things a bit more interesting, where we're going to grab the value that we have within the input. And first of all, again, let me comment this out. First, I'm going to copy and paste it. And then we're going to comment this out. So you have it for your reference, like so. But then we're going to change the last one from key down to a key up. And like I said, in order to make this interesting, we're going to grab the value. And in order to show you where we're grabbing the value from, instead of just giving you the property, I'm going to show you where we can see that property. So where we have the add event listener within the function, instead of console log, we're going to go with console dir, and then we're going to console the name input. So we're going to take a look at which property holds in fact the value. And key up is when we release the key. So if I head over to the form and I press something, notice of course my event fired. But what I'm looking for is this giant object again with the properties, with the methods, because that's the node object that I'm getting back. But what I'm looking for is the value property. Notice that value property holds right now RD. So this is what we're going to use when we're going to be getting the values from the form. Again, I could have just told you that that is the property, but I just wanted to show you how you can find it. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, so once the key up, I would want to console log name input, and I'm going to console log the value. And you're going to see that each and every time you're going to press the key in the console, you're going to get the last value from the form. So let's say key, and 3 times I had K, I had KE, and then I had, in fact, key. So each and every time I released the key, the event fired, and each and every time we were getting that current value that we have within the form. And that's how we can work with key press, key down, as well as key up events in JavaScript. Properties and what methods we are going to find useful. And in order to set this up in my index.html, I have a button with the class of button, and then some heading, as well as I have the link. Now for the link, I added a bit of CSS, where I have display inline block, and margin top is 100 view height. And essentially what happens, we need to scroll down to see the link. And the default behavior in HTML for the links is once we click on a link, we're going to scroll back to the top of the page. And in this video, we're going to see how we can use our event object to, in fact, prevent that behavior. I'm going to start very simply by selecting the heading as well as the button. And we already know how to do that. We have const, and let's say heading. Then we're going to go for document query selector, and I'm going to be looking for the heading 1. And I'm going to copy and paste it, and I'm just going to change this around to a button. So let's change around our variable, as well as the query selector, where we're looking for the class. And now let's say I would want to add a event listener for the heading, the click event listener, and then each and every time I'm going to click on a heading, I would like to apply the class of blue. So some kind of CSS. So let's write heading, add event listener. I'm going to be listening for click events. And then of course I have my callback function. So I have my callback function, and I know that for now, if I would want to select the heading, we have covered it. Of course, I would just need to select, again, the same node object that I'm getting back. So I'm going to go with heading, then I'm going to go with class list, and then I'm going to say, let's say blue. And what's going to happen is that every time I'm going to click on heading, of course, I'm going to apply this class. However, what do you think is going to happen if, let's say, I'm going to misspell my variable name? If I'm not going to select heading, I'm going to select headings. Again, let's refresh. And currently I can click all day long and nothing is going to happen. So why don't we take a look at how we can use our event object to always select the element that has the event listener attached to it. So in this case, we're going to be selecting heading. But when we're going to add a click event, let's say to a button, we always are going to select that particular element from our callback function. And please keep in mind the same would work if we would use the function reference. So I'm writing here an anonymous function, but please understand that argument is also for the reference if we set it up as a function, the event argument. And again, we can write this as an event, we can write this as E, it doesn't really matter as long as you access, of course, the same name within your function body. So I'm going to type in the long way, I'm just going to say event. And first of all, let's maybe get rid of that. And let's just console log what we're getting back as an event. And again, we should see a giant object up in our console. So once we click on the sum heading, then of course this is our giant object. And like I said, there is a bunch of properties here as well as the methods, and the goal is not to remember them all. But one property that we were going to find useful is the current target. So if we're gonna select event and current target, we should see what element we clicked on. So we're gonna go with dot current target. And let's see, again, let me refresh. And once I click on it, I have the heading one. So I know for sure that I have clicked on heading one. And by the way, if you would like to double check, why don't we copy and paste our event listener. So let me copy and paste, and we're going to set this up for the button. Just so you can see that if we click on a button, our event current target value is going to be different from the heading in the button. So that way, it's always going to be pointing to a button. So let me write btn, again, add event listener, click event, and then I would like to see the current target. And if I'm going to click on a button, check it out. Now I'm getting back the button. And what happens right now, if I use my event current target, I can do the same things like we did before. Let's say if we would want to add our class of blue, well, I'm just going to change this around. I'm going to say event current target. So now I'm for sure accessing my button. And then I'm just going to say class list and not current target. So we're going to go with class list. We're going to add, and we're going to add our class list of blue. And once we set everything up, and if I'm going to head over and click on a button, notice, of course, I'm going to get my background of blue and the rest of the properties that I'm getting from CSS because I added the class. And again, current target property is always going to point to a element that has that add event listener attached to it. So always, this is going to point to that particular element. And what more properties we would find useful? Well, we could look for event type. So that way we can always find out what kind of event it is. So let's go with event, and we're going to look for type. It should return a click event. Sure enough, now I can see in the console that it is a click event. And then also we have a prevent default. Now prevent default method prevents the default behavior. So let's say in our case, like I said, for the link, if we're going to click on the link, we're always going to scroll back to the top of the page. And if we would want to prevent that, we would need to run event prevent default. And first, I guess, let's select our link. So we're going to say const. I'm going to call this link document. I'm going to go with, document get element by ID, get element by ID, and I'm going to look for the link. And let's add, again, our event listener. So link, add event listener. And we're going to be listening again for the click event. And in this case, you know what? Why don't we set up a separate function? Just so you can trust me that, in fact, we can access the same event object even if we have the reference. So let's say sum func. So I'm going to have some function. The name is going to be sum func, just because I'm lazy coming up with the name. And of course, that is going to be my callback function. So let's say once we click on a link, I'm going to run sum func. Again, please keep in mind, we're not invoking it. We're just referencing the function. And if I'm going to select my event, and maybe in this time I'm going to type E, just so you can see that we can have the same behavior. I'm going to say E, and then we're going to run our prevent default. And since it is a method, we need to run it here. And now you're going to see that if we head over back to our index.html, and if I click on a link, we're not scrolling back to the top of the page. because we prevented their default. And that is very useful, by the way, with forms. So we're going to use this a lot with the forms because whenever you submit a form, in fact, there's a page refresh, and that's going to be something that we're going to do where we're going to prevent that particular behavior. And lastly, I would like to talk about this keyword. And we haven't talked about it previously when we covered object, but in fact, there is another way how we can select that particular element, and that is by using this keyword. However, I would want to suggest to take it easy on this keyword at this point, because this keyword is by far probably, especially if you're starting out in JavaScript, one of the most confusing things. So even though it's going to work in this case, it's going to select that particular element as well. I mean, there's a lot of confusion that comes with this keyword. And by the way, I'm going to show you a quick example of that. But let's say if we're looking for the heading, I could also say the same way log, and then I'm just going to console log this. And you're going to see that if we click on heading, we are still selecting the same element. So you could, instead of using the event and let's say current target, you could just use this. And you're looking at it and you're probably, well, why we went through all this hassle if we could have just used this? Well, first of all, the event object, of course, has way more than just current target. So it has way more properties as well as useful information. So you should always be aware of the event object. That's point number one. Point number two, even though it works in this case, like I said, since this keyword is somewhat confusing, especially in the beginning when you're starting out with JavaScript, if we would use the arrow function, it wouldn't work. Now, we haven't covered the arrow functions. So again, don't stress about the syntax, but if I'm just going to change this around, and if I'm not going to use the function keyword, that would be the syntax for the arrow function. And if I'm going to create my fat arrow function, you're going to notice that if I click on some heading, in this point, we still can access the event object. So that still works. But then this is not pointing anymore to a heading one. So even though this keyword will work if we just use a regular function, I would suggest at this point sticking to a event and then current target. And only once we cover objects in depth and then we understand how this keyword works, then you can start using this. Again, it's really up to you, but just don't be surprised if the behavior is not exactly like you're expecting. And also, I just want to quickly mention that using the current target, we can still traverse it down. So we can still do the parent element, the child nodes, and all that. And in fact, we're going to cover that in more depth once we start working with the project. So just to recap, whenever we have events, we have access as an argument to an event object, and we can have, of course, E or EVT, or we can write the event. Since it is an argument, we can call this however we want. There we can find the info about triggered event, and the properties we looked at was type, the current target, as well as preventing the default. Within the button. Let's say one strong tag, but in my case, I placed two of them. So what is going to be difference between the event target and the event current target? And I guess we're going to navigate to app.js. And first, we're just going to select all the buttons. So I'm going to come up with some kind of variable. I'm going to say btn, and then I'm going to use a document, query selector, all, and I'm going to be looking for all the buttons. So I'm just going to grab all the buttons. However, the class is btn. Now, once I have access to all the buttons, the goal is adding a green color to a button we click on. So if I click on the first button, then the text is going to be green. If I click on a third button, text is green. And you get an idea, the same would work for the second button. Okay, so I have my node list. Awesome. So now I can use a btn s, then for each method, and now we're looping over our button. Because again, I would want to select all of them. It's not that I'm selecting one by one. Because I have a class, I'm going to select all of them, and then I'm going to use the current target. So only when I click on a specific button, then the text of that button is going to turn green. Not all of them, but only the button I click on. All right. So I'm looping over. I have my callback function that's just going to be applied to each and every item. And then I'm going to call my item btn. But of course, you can always call this orange as well. And since I'm passing this within my function, by the way, I'm skipping ahead. I'm using the arrow function. my bad. So this is the callback function we're using. This is the syntax we know for now, the function. And then, of course, we are passing in the parameter, so we can call this, like I said, whatever we would want. So I'm going to go with btn. And then for all the buttons that we have in a list, I would want to add a event listener. And then within the event listener, we need to specifically write two things. What element we're listening for. So we're listening for click event. And then there's going to be a function that handles it. And in this case, again, I'm going to write my anonymous function, the callback function, right there. All right, so I have my function. Now what? Well, we can use the current target, since each and every time I'm using the current target, I'm accessing the element that I'm clicking on. So let's write E. And then first, I guess we can just console log it. We can just say E current target, just so you can see which button we're selecting. And next, since I know already that I'm going to select that particular button I'm clicking on, well, I can just use event, current target. Then remember the property was style, color, and green. And notice, previously we had to select the element in order to do that, correct? We selected the element. Now in this case, I select a list of elements, and then I just use current target. And again, we can change whatever properties you would want. So I'm going to go with green. Let's save it. And you're going to notice the moment I click on the first button, first of all, I'm selecting the button number 1. I can clearly see in my console the text is first button. And second, I'm changing the color. So if I'm going to click on the third button, then of course the same thing is going to happen. If I'm going to click on the second button, well, the same functionality is going to take place. All right. So now let's take a look at the target. And you know what? For your reference, I'm just going to comment this out. And let's try the same thing with the target. So first of all, we're going to console log and say e.target. And by the way, if you want to check it out, the target property, just console log the event. So each and every time I'm going to click on it, notice I'm going to get, again, my giant event object. And you can look for target property. It's right there. So there is a current target as well as the target property. And now let's test it out with a target. So let's write target. First, we're going to console log. And by the way, since I know that I'm going to have side-by-side current target, here I'm just going to write that I'm console log the target property. And then when I'm going to console log the current target, then I'm going to add also the string before the current target. And now let's try the event target. And now let's do style and color. So the same functionality, or we're using the target. Let's save it and let's see what's going to happen. Well, I click on the first button and everything is exactly the same. I'm selecting the first button. I can clearly see that, as well as the color changes only on the first button. All right. Now the same works for the third button, but check it out. If I'm going to click on one of my elements, the strong tag, whether that would be a button or more nested one. So there's two of them. But again, keep in mind there could be one, but the point is, if you're clicking on an element that is within the button, what do you think is going to happen? Is the whole button going to turn color green or no? And probably I already gave away the answer, and the answer is that no. Only the element that I'm clicking on is going to get this color. That's the difference between the target and the current target, where current target always refers to the element to which the event handler has been attached to. So since we added the event handlers to our buttons, that's why when I use the current target, I'm always referencing the button itself. However, if I'm using the target, well, the target is going to identify the element on which the event occurred. So in this case, since we clicked on the nested element within the button, only the text for that particular element turned green. Now let me refresh and let me show you even more that if I click on more nested, which is a strong tag within a strong tag, then only that text changes to green. And you can clearly see that my target is in fact the strong element. It is not a button itself. And again, like I said, we can just console log just so we can see better. So current, and we're going to go target, and of course my property is also going to change. We're current target, and then I should see if I click on the strong tags, then there's going to be one for the target, which is going to be strong element, and then the second one is going to be button itself. Again, let me try it out, and yes, my target is going to be the strong element. However, the current target which refers to the element to which the event handler has been attached to, well, that is a button. So that would be the difference between using the current target and the target property that are both available on our event object. Let's say the ID or, I don't know, a tag name. However, once we understand the bubbling and as well as the capture, we can understand how we can select element even though we haven't targeted directly. And the way it's going to work, up in the index.html, we're going to have a container with a class of, let's say, container, then on our list with a class of list items, then a list item with a class of, let's say, item, but it doesn't really matter. We're not going to be selecting it. And then within the list item, we're going to have a link. Now, link is going to have a class, but we're not going to target link directly. In fact, we're going to target the list items as well as the container. So first, I guess, let's select both of them. Let's say const container. Then we're going to have a document, then query selector. We're going to be looking for the container, and then we're going to do the same thing with list items. So in this case, I'm going to target list items class. So list items, and then we're going to go with list. We're just going to go with list. And we're going to set up the same callback function for both of them. And we're going to add a event listener, of course, for both of them as well. So first, let's start, I guess, with the list. Let's add event listener. We're going to be looking for a click event. So we're going to be listening for a click event. And the function is going to be show bubbling, which, by the way, is the default. And I'm going to come up with that function. So I'm going to say function. Then we're going to name it show bubbling. Then, of course, we do need to have the event. And now let's start very simply by getting the current target as well as the target. So the way it works, we're going to go with console log. Then we're going to go with current target, like so. And of course, we already know how we can access it. The event, that was our parameter. And then the property is current target. We're going to copy and paste. And we're going to look for the target. So we're going to go with not current target, but we're going to write target. And then instead of property of current target, also we're going to have a target property. And like I said, I'm going to do the same thing for my container. So let's copy and paste and change from list to a container. And you're going to notice something really, really interesting and cool, where if I click on the link, in fact, both of them are going to fire. So the list is going to fire as well as the container. And we might be wondering, well, why? Because we didn't add event listeners to actual link. We added to a parent containers. You see what happens by default, we have something called bubbling, where we click on the element. Let's say in our case, that is going to be a link, but then we're going to register that event up the chain. Now, technically, we don't need to do anything, but we're still going to register the event. We're going to register an event on the list, on a container, and by the way, all the way to a document and then window. Now let's take a look at how it's going to look like. So if I click on a link, notice the current target is the list items, but the actual target is going to be a link. So the same works with container, where we have a container and then the actual target was the link. And next video, we're going to see how that in fact works with dynamic elements. So the elements we're adding ourselves, but just to give you an idea that if, let's say, we click on something, in fact, we're registering that event up the chain. And like I said, just to show you how it's going to work, let's say if we're going to go to a document, the same thing is going to happen. You're going to see the document is also going to fire that event. Now, again, when I say fire, it's going to register that event. So it's going to say, all right, so, yep, that event took place. Now, we're not going to do anything with that, but still, click on a link and notice current target list items, then I have the container, then I have the document, and then I have the window. And again, please keep in mind, the most important thing that I would want you to take away from this video is the fact that we can select elements without even targeting them. So without even going query selector, we can just say, all right, so add some kind of event listener to parent element, and then I'm going to be accessing the actual element that I'm clicking on. So let's say in our example, we could come up with some kind of simple if statement where I could say if the target class list contains a link, that means that I'm actually clicking on a link. Now I'm going to comment out the rest of them, of course, because my console is getting quite busy. So let's comment this out. And let's say that if the target is a link, then, well, it actually is a link. So let's go with if event target class list. Remember that was the property, class list. And then we're going to go with contains, and we're looking for a class of link. So if the target that I'm clicking on actually contains a link, well, we can just simply say a console log that it is a link. But of course, eventually we're going to do way more than that. So we can say you click on the link. That's it. And now if I'm going to click on the link, check it out. Now it's going to say, all right, so you click on the link. Because, of course, the event target, in fact, is my link. But my current target is the list items. And even though I didn't directly use add event listener to a link, I was still able to access it. Now, like I previously mentioned, bubbling is happening by default. So if we click on the lowest, deepest nested element, our event is going to bubble up. So we're going to be able to register all the way up to the window. However, we can prevent that behavior because since it is a default behavior, well, we can just override that. And the way I'm going to show you that is that if we're going to look, let's say, for the list item, I'm going to add another function. And this function is going to stop the propagation. So that way, I'm not going to be able to listen for those events on, let's say, container, which is a parent, and document, or a window. So first, let's come up with a function. I'm going to go with function. Then the name is going to be stop propagation, like so. Then it is a function. We're still going to access the event, but we're going to call a method. And the method is on the event object. And we just write here stop. And then the method name is propagation, like so. Let's save it. And now let's reference not show bubbling in our list, but now let's reference stop propagation. And what you're going to notice that even though previously when we just used a show bubbling, all of them showed up. The container showed up in our console, the document and window, because again, our event was bubbling up. In this case, you're going to notice that I'm only going to get a link if I click on a link. Now I'm still listening for the rest of the events. That's the reason why if you click on, let's say, anywhere in document, you're going to get a document as well as the window. But if I'm going to refresh, and if let's say we're going to click only on a link, check it out. We're only clicking on a link and nothing else happens. Now we can console log just so you can see that for sure we're doing something. So you click on, let's say, a list, like so. And we're going to see that one in the console. So we clicked on a list. However, unlike before, where we were registering pretty much all the way up the chain, in this case, it's not happening because we used stop propagation. And you know what? I'm going to change back to bubbling. I'm going to say here, show bubbling, like so. And we're going to talk about the capturing. And capturing is the same as the bubbling. However, it happens from the root and it goes all the way down. Because if you noticed previously when we were registering those events, well, it happened again from the parent, then the parent of the parent, and all the way up the chain. And it wasn't because my order in the JavaScript file was like this. I could move list down. You can still refresh, and you're going to see the first one is going to be list items. Then we're going to have the container. Then we're going to have a document, and only then we're going to have the window. And in this case, I'm going to comment out the target as well as the if statement, just so our console is less busy. And you're going to notice that if we add a third argument to our add event listener, in fact, the order is going to change. So we're not going to start by parent, then parent of the parent, and then all the way up to a window. In fact, we're going to start from the window. And the way it works is we're going to add it as a third argument. So I'm going to have, let's say, 4 cursors, 1, 2, and then we're going to add a comma. And our third argument is going to be capture true. And again, let's check it out. Let's click on it, and now we have a window first, then we have a document, then we have a container, and then we have a list items. So default behavior, it is going to bubble up, where again we're going to have a parent of the parent, all the way up to a window where we can register those events. However, there's also an option of capturing, where we start from the root and go all the way down to our actual element, which in our case was of course the link, but we were registering on the list items. That's the reason why the list items are the last one. I'm fully aware that you're probably a bit confused after the last video. We have the bubbling, we have the propagation, we have stop propagation, we also have capturing. Why all that matters? And that's why we're going to come up with a very simple example where we are going to add some element dynamically, and we're going to check it out how bubbling in fact allows us to select that element and then do whatever we would want with that element. Up in my index.html, I have a div with a class of container. Then currently I have the heading, but we're going to add that dynamically. So it has a heading 1 with a class of heading, as well as I have the button with a class of btn and text of click. And then we're going to navigate back to app.js. And first we're going to target all three things: the container, button, and heading. And we're going to set up a very, very simple event listener for just a heading. So first let's target all three of them. So const container is equal to document, then query selector. And in this case, all of them are going to have the query selector. The difference is going to be, of course, the classes we're selecting. So 1, 2, 3. Let's change these values around. So I'm going to delete all the containers that I had. All the containers are gone. And the second one is going to be, I guess, the btn. So button. Then the class, of course, is also button. And I'm going to do the same thing for my heading. So the heading is going to be a class as well as the actual variable name. So let me have two of them, heading, and let's save that. Now I have selected all three things. Of course, we can console log it if we want, but we're going to skip that a bit. And then we're going to set up just for the heading a event listener. I'm going to go with heading. Then I'm going to go with add event listener. We're going to be listening for click event. And in this case, we're going to set up a say hello function. So just to have it different, I'm going to have it as a reference instead of an anonymous function. So let's come up with a function. Let's say function, say hello, and then this function is just going to console out the greeting. So we're going to go with console log, and we're going to go, I don't know, with hello, something like that, or hello there. Hello there, and now of course we just need to reference the function. Let's say hello, and then of course the moment I'm going to click on a heading, I'm going to have the hello there. And the more times I'm going to click on it, well, the more console logs I'm going to have. However, let me throw you a mind grenade. What if we would add this heading dynamically? What would happen? Well, we can test it out. We can first set up a event listener for the button. So each and every time I'm clicking the button, I'm going to create a new element, and I'm going to append this to my container. So I can just say btn add event listener, and again, click event, just to change things around. I'm just going to go with anonymous function, so function, like so. And then once I click, I'm going to create a new element. And we already covered those methods, so let's go with const element. Then we need to use document, of course. Then we're creating a new element. So create element. What element I would like to create? I don't know. I'm going to go with heading 1. And then also, I'm going to add right away a class list. So essentially, I'm recreating the same heading that I had. So I'm going to go with element, class, not class name, sorry, class list. Then we're going to add, and we're going to add our class of heading. And then, of course, I would also want some kind of text content. So I'm going to go with the same one. I'm sitting inside the container. So element, text, content, and it's going to be equal to a template string. And I am inside the container, something like that. Maybe I didn't have the, but whatever. And then lastly, again, we're going to append this to a container. So we're going to go with append child, like so. And then we're going to go with our element. Now I'm going to navigate back to index.html, and in fact, I'm going to comment out the heading because I would want to add all of them dynamically. And the moment I'm going to do that, I'm going to get an error. And why we're getting the error? Well, we're getting the error because we are trying to add a method of add event listener to a null. Because right now our heading does not exist in the document. And you can clearly see that by just console logging. Console out the heading, and you know what? I'm gonna comment out my event listener, and you're gonna see that we're getting back to null. So we cannot add event listener to a element that does not exist. All right, fine. But now let's try to add them dynamically. I'm gonna keep on clicking, like so, and you would think right now that once the headings are already in a document, well, we could add the event listeners again. But check it out. We're still getting back to null. So even if I'm going to head down and if I'm going to uncomment it, I'm still going to get back my error. So I can just keep on clicking, and even though I'm adding my headings, I'm adding them dynamically. I can see that if I check the elements, the headings are there, but I cannot access them using the class because when I run this code, those headings are not there. So what would be the solution? Well, we already know that we have propagation, and more specifically, we have bubbling by default. How does the bubbling work? Well, we could target the parent element and then say if the target is, let's say, heading, well, then we're just going to console log it, correct? So why don't we comment out the event listener as well as the console log for the heading, and we might as well also comment out the heading itself, because there's no point of selecting it. We already know that we're adding them dynamically. And then we're going to set up a function for the container. So the way that is going to work, we're going to say container, then we're going to have a add event listener. Again, we're going to be listening for click events. And now we need to pass in, again, our callback function. And then within the callback function, what we're going to do? Well, we can access the event object, correct? And in this case, I can just set up a if statement where I say, all right, if event target class list, and then we go with contains, and we're going to be looking for heading. If that is the case, now let's console log the hello there. Again, obviously we can do way more than just console logging, but for our simple example, it's going to do. So we're going to go with hello there. In this case, then, if I click on the button, I keep adding, of course, my headings. But if I click on the actual headings, we're going to see in a console that we have a bunch of hello there. So in this case, we're not targeting right away the element. In fact, we are using the fact that the event is going to bubble up. So we can target our parent container, and that way we're going to be able to access the actual element that we're clicking on.